Hello, everyone. Welcome to our 13th installment of Safe Space for White Questions. My name is Alex Kasnabish. I sell my labor for a wage at Mount St. Vincent University, where I'm a professor of sociology and anthropology. And this week or this month, I'll be leading things off. But before I go any further, I'm going to toss it over to my partner in crime and ask him to introduce himself as well. AJ?
Hi, everyone. I'm AJ Parasaram, Ajay Parasaram. I also sell my labor at a local university, Dalhousie University here in Timbuktu. I work in the departments of International Development Studies and History and a little bit of political science, and on occasion, the Faculty of Medicine, whatever floats your boat. I'm really happy to be here to continue this conversation at our new and hopefully more accessible time to our friends out on the West Coast. So yeah, without further ado, back to you, Alex.
Yes, thanks, AJ. And I just, as always, I just want to acknowledge that this series is coming to you from unceded, unsurrendered Mi'kmaq territory in Kizipuktuk, Mi'kma'ki. We want to acknowledge that, of course, and we also want to acknowledge the wonderful labor and support of our friends at Fernwood Publishing, who bottom line this and promote this and make this series possible. Check them out online and look at their excellent catalog of books if you haven't already done that. For those who are new to this, welcome. If it's your first time, if you're watching us live, you'll note, of course, that we're doing this at a different time. This is our new time. We have moved our standard start time to a time that's a little bit more West Coast friendly, so we can, reach more folks across the continent. And of course, if you do miss us live, you're always welcome to check us out on Fernwood's YouTube channel, and the complete episode playlist is there as well. So, if you're new, I'm sure you'll catch on very quickly. This is indeed a safe space for difficult questions and difficult conversations about racism, about white supremacy, about racial justice and collective liberation. And while both AJ and I work in these areas and do research in these areas and have done activism in these areas, neither of us are claiming to be experts on any of the specific topics we'll necessarily talk about. So we're here to engage you, to navigate questions together, and hopefully do so in a spirit of generosity and openness, and but a deep-seated commitment to liberating this very messy, very toxic, very unjust social reality for all of us. Anyway, without any further ado, I'm going to get right to our questions this week. So we have a few questions from this month, and then some dating back further that we have not yet had a chance to get to. So we might dip into those. As usual, we alternate who gets to start and who gets to finish. So this month, I get to be the leadoff hitter on these ones, and then I'll pass it over to AJ. Once again, just welcome, folks. So let's get right to it. Our questions for September. Very first one, very topical, given the date tomorrow. What are your opinions on this new national holiday tomorrow? So, of course, here we're talking about the National Day for Truth and Reconciliation, newly declared holiday, day of reflection, a bunch of events going on, obviously all across so-called Canada. Both from a variety of perspectives, right? So what do I have to say about this? I would say, okay, this is a safe space, so I'm going to start off with my most sort of cynical and humorous take, and trust a settler to take a first step down the path to reconciliation by declaring a holiday. That's all I'd say. It's, a day off obviously is important. Not every province has decided to acknowledge this day. I'll point out too. So it's unevenly distributed across the country. But I think in principle, it's obviously an important thing to do. Any kind of public commemoration is, of an important event that gives people space and permission and time to discuss things, to participate in public activities and events is a good thing. And, from an anti-capitalist perspective, I'll just throw this in there. Anytime the working class gets a day that they don't have to work, if you're lucky enough to be one of those people who doesn't have to work tomorrow, then that's also a good thing. I suppose I would say I always think that the first steps down a real path to reconciliation begin with returning the land and acknowledging the existence of the political sovereignty. I don't like the term sovereignty. I'd say autonomy of Indigenous peoples, Indigenous nations in relation to Canada. So I'd like to see a more material starting place. I actually don't think that that's such a, well, that always seems like kind of a hard sell for people, for settler Canadians to think about. I actually think in principle, it's not such a difficult thing to begin to imagine. And that's the only thing that I think is really going to start moving us down a path of genuine reconciliation between Indigenous peoples and settler society in this territory. So great. Tomorrow, hopefully people will take the time to reflect, to think about what it means to decolonize, to reconcile, what it means from the perspective of settlers and Indigenous people, that could happen, to undertake action collectively, to have conversations with your loved ones, with your family. Your kids aren't in school, maybe you have extended family around if you're lucky enough not to be totally isolated right now, and have those conversations. Attend a public event. There are lots of marches, walks, events going on tomorrow, both led by Indigenous peoples and by allies, by settler allies in different contexts. Avail yourself of the National Film Board of Canada's publicly available film series that focus on Indigenous issues, like Alanis Obasawan's excellent documentaries. Do something like that at least, But again, my honest take is, all right, enough commemoration, enough symbolic gesturing. Let's get down to brass tacks here. Let's talk about what it means to actually live in a nation-to-nation relationship with Indigenous peoples and begin to articulate that. Let's return, from the settler state's perspective, return the land, return resources, cede and acknowledge the autonomy, and then we can do something real. Until then, it's lovely but superficial window dressing. Over to you, AJ. Oh, you were muted.
Thank you. So to build on what Alex has said, I think that this is a good, it's obviously overall, it's a good thing. Taking a day, ideally as a country, it shows us the fact that not everybody in the country has chosen to honor the day, that actually we're not that far advanced down any of this pathway to truth and reconciliation. If we can't even get national buy-in, that this is an important day to take away from kind of labor productivity. So I'm going to say a little bit about the kind of problematic intersection of capitalism here, and then some more broader optimistic reflections about the day. So the first thing is that I think it gives non-Indigenous people time away from their work or whatever it is that they're doing to actually build up their knowledge on the truth side of truth and reconciliation. I think that Indigenous people have demonstrated over and over again that they understand the truth, that they have lived intergenerationally, that they've gone to an outrageous degree of effort to help educate non-Indigenous people about what this history looks like through publications, through testimony, through art, through every possible mean that we could have. But that the overwhelming majority of settlers in Canada, this thing called Canada, have still not educated themselves and availed themselves of all of these many resources that are there to help educate people about the real history of this territory. So I hope that for the first couple of years in particular, that settlers take this as an opportunity and a demand to focus on the truth aspect of truth and reconciliation. Like Senator or former Senator Murray Sinclair said, this is the beginning of a long journey. And the reason that it has to be such a long journey is on settlers, right? And I think that that's important because I feel like Indigenous people have done more than their share of the work to try and build the context for reconciliation. But there can't be reconciliation if there's no general agreement on things that are true, on things that have generally happened. So it's up to settlers to focus on the truth. In terms of kind of more general critique of how this gets woven into capitalism, one of our colleagues at Fernwood was telling me, I was saying rather optimistically and perhaps naively, oh, I was glad to see on Twitter that, people are tweeting about the Indigenous companies that are producing the orange shirts so that people can buy from Indigenous companies. That seems like a good thing. And our colleague at Fernwood was like, yeah, but what you didn't see is that lots of settlers are getting really angry that there's been delays in the delivery of their orange shirts. And now they're like giving shit to the Indigenous producers of these orange shirts that they might not get their orange shirt on, in time for the holiday. And what a just spectacular failure of the opportunity presented to us, right? So you need to, I think settlers need to take this as a provocation to not think that you can compartmentalize, decolonization, to understand that decolonization is related to indigenization, but is distinct from it, is related to anti-capitalism, but is also distinct from it. These are all aspects of a broader project of building the context for reconciliation. Because I think the piece that is always missed is that reconciliation doesn't mean creating the conditions for Indigenous people to quote unquote join Canadian society. That is actually assimilation. That's colonialism and cultural genocide. And that's exactly what the principles of truth and reconciliation are supposed to be against. And I have having reviewed some of the testimony, not even all of it yet myself, the testimony that went into the Truth and Reconciliation Commission and the report that's all publicly available and easily accessible to anybody who wants to read it. All you need to do is read through these testimonials and you will read the firsthand accounts of people who have endured absolutely heinous things. Talk about residential schools. This is not an abstract thing. This is a literal thing that people alive today had to go through as children. And it's important. There is no truth if you don't read those things and consider those things. Try to imagine as much as you can, well, I won't say try to put yourself in that situation because you can't. If you haven't lived these certain experiences, you can't put yourself in it. But remind yourself of your common humanity and think about what kind of country it is that you want to live in. However problematic countries in the state are going to be, what kind of country do you want to live in 20 years from now? And that's the scope that we're fighting for here, because you got to remember, while there's I think a sincere group of people who are fighting for truth and reconciliation, those attempts are being met by a whole other group of people who are violently opposed to this, right? And I don't and maybe this is getting ahead of myself, but it matters that a party like the People's Party of Canada was at times polling at close to 10% in the last election, more than all the other fringe parties. I don't want to talk about partisan politics here, but because I actually don't care that they didn't win a seat or anything like that. The fact that the kind of collective ideology of that kind of individualistic, libertarian, gone awry kind of white nationalist narrative is appealing to 1 out of every 10 Canadians to the point where they would identify with a group like that, is indicative of how every small step that we make towards positive social change will be met with violent and vitriolic backlash. So I want all of the settlers in particular who are listening to this podcast to commit themselves to fighting against that in your own family. Because obviously, if we're talking about 10% of the population, 1 in every 10 Canadians, it means that they're in all of our families, right? So look for that. Look for that. Commit to educating yourself. Commit to 5 years of truth before you start thinking about terms of reconciliation. And that's why I think, I do think that I'm seeing little small shops and businesses putting up signs that they're taking the day, that they're encouraging their employees and helping to provide them with resources. My sense is that in general, the majority of Canadians are disgusted at the history of colonial genocide in this country. That's what the majority thinks. They want to live in a place that they don't have to be ashamed of. And the next step is, are we collectively willing to take the steps necessary to recognize Indigenous sovereignty or autonomy, whatever term you want to do, and to make those hard decisions and commitments when it goes against our selfish kind of material interests? And there again, and I'll leave it there with like the kind of inherent anti-capitalist requirement here, is that part of the last 400 years of colonialism has been this pernicious normalization of homo economicus, right? So the idea that human beings are by their nature self-interested utility maximizers. I don't think anything could be further from the truth. I think that that's a very particular understanding of human nature that has been universalized to justify an economic system that has been incredibly destructive while producing enormous wealth for an obscure minority of humanity. So, resisting that tendency to want to say, well, what's in it for me? I want to learn something. I want to consume a shirt. I want to consume Indigenous products. That's not what it's about. It's about discovering alternative ways to think about imagining how you, your community, and the country that you live in can operate. Back to you, Alex.
Yeah, very, very eloquently said, AJ, for sure. So we have the next couple of questions dovetail a little bit. So I'm going to take them together because that's my purview as the person running the show this week. So they're both questions about what we're talking about right now, about decolonization, reconciliation. But one is about what was a bit of a throwaway comment, but I'm happy to talk about it right now because I think it's important. So the one person asked, why don't you like the term sovereignty? And I had said that. And then the second part two of the question, it's a separate question really, is do you think provinces not recognizing tomorrow as a public holiday are making a bad move? So I'm going to take the sovereignty question first because I don't want to lose it as we move on into other questions. And I'm going to say simply, this could kind of be a much longer conversation, obviously. It's kind of like a political theory question. It's a question of like my anti-authoritarian politics fundamentally. But yeah, my objection to the term sovereignty is that the idea of the sovereign that individual, that office that stands up Enlightenment through the birth of the modern nation state order that we now exist in, is this idea that it's the people, the writ large, who are the source of political authority, right? Like we've just had an election in Canada. Some of us went out and voted. The idea is that no government is legitimate unless it represents the will of the people. And that's kind of the instantiation, the manifestation of sovereignty. So sovereignty for me is, first of all, problematic in a context where we're talking about decolonization, because it doesn't seem to me to speak to the aspirations of many diverse decolonial or Indigenous struggles that are aiming to reconstitute their ability to exist, to lead a dignified collective existence in relation to either themselves or to a settler society. It's a Eurocentric concept that even for many of us who kind of float in that Eurocentric political theory bubble don't recognize, right? So anarchists, for example, wouldn't recognize sovereignty as something we're struggling towards. What anarchists would prefer is a dissolution of the state and a different form of political authority, right? That we would negotiate with each other. That's non-coercive. I prefer, and I think it's more accurate in terms of speaking to what a broad range of struggles want, not just Indigenous struggles, but others too, other anti-colonial, anti-imperialist struggles, is autonomy, the ability to give oneself law, to rule over oneself or one's society. I like autonomy because it doesn't preclude you having your autonomy. It insists that our autonomy is relational, not that one of us is going to be sovereign and thus rule over other people in a fundamentally coercive top-down way. So I think sovereignty is I'm not going to bash people who use it in support of social justice struggles. I'm not going to tell Indigenous people they don't have the right to use it. Obviously, that's not what I'm suggesting at all. But from a perspective of walking a path towards collective liberation for all of us, I don't think when we get to the end of that road, we're going to be talking about like popular sovereignty or, a sovereign political authority that somehow has solved it for all of us. I think we're going to be talking about political, social, economic relationships that we work out and live in ways that are not coercive, that are not violent, that are not oppressive and extractive. And those won't be sovereign, they'll be autonomous or they'll be relational. So that's my Cole's Notes take on my problem with sovereignty. I don't think sovereignty gets us out of the problem of some people having a great deal of power and exercising it over others. Maybe since my answer to the second question will be quick, I'll just do that and then throw it back to AJ, and he can take them both if he wants, or just address one if he wants to. But yes, I absolutely think that the provinces not choosing to recognize tomorrow as a statutory holiday are making a bad move in the language of the question. So just to be clear, 6 Canadian provinces and territories are marking it. That includes the Northwest Territories, the Yukon, British Columbia, Manitoba, Nova Scotia, and Prince Edward Island, as well as all federal employees, right? So the federal government's recognizing it. Alberta, Saskatchewan, Quebec, Ontario, New Brunswick, and Nunavut are not recognizing the day as a provincial statutory holiday. So I'm not quite sure what the reasoning is, to be honest. I haven't looked into the reasoning given by any of those provincial officials for why they're not marking it as a stat day. But I'd say this is super low-hanging fruit. I don't understand why you wouldn't mark it in such a way. It's a representation of the value attached to a given day, albeit symbolically. Whether you choose to mark it as a day off of work, off of compelled labor or not, it's like if Christmas Day wasn't that day anymore, imagine how many white Christian folks or just Christian folks in this country would be incensed by that, right? If Thanksgiving or Easter or whatever, all of these things that are obviously belong to certain traditions and are closely associated, not just with kind of, a secular society, but also with people's particular traditions. If they weren't marked that way, or if they stopped being marked that way, there'd be huge uproar, right? So I think, if we want to symbolically invest this day with a mark of significance, it ought to come with, that sort of highest bar signification, which in our capitalist world is a day where you're not compelled to work. Unfortunately, to come back to AJ's question or AJ's point about how anti-capitalism, collective liberation, decolonization struggles, how they're not the same, but there's important intersections. There is an important intersection here, right? About a day where if you want people to have time to reflect, to engage in activity that's collective, that maybe starts to get people thinking about the kind of society that AJ was talking about, right? Like where you want to be in 5 years, what kind of society you want to inhabit, then you have to give people the time off toil to do that. If you're not willing to do that, it means you don't really care that much. And frankly, the list of provinces, though not totally predictable, contains many political regimes. I'm not talking about the people who live in those provinces, but political regimes which are ideologically opposed to this kind of maneuver, right? Ideologically opposed to the principle of decolonization or reconciliation, and certainly opposed to challenging the underlying power relations that animate it. And so, that's not to say those provinces that are marking it are somehow, angelic in their orientation, but at least they're to some extent putting their money where their mouth is. So I'll leave it at that. It's a bad move for sure. AJ?
Yeah, thanks, Al. While you were talking there, I just started doing some just basic Googling just to see what the news articles were saying about the various different provinces. And I'll say it basically matched up a lot to what you were saying. A lot of the ones that threw me for a loop, and that's why I started looking it up in answer to this question about, I'll take sovereignty after, but do you think not recognizing the holiday is a mistake? was when he said Nunavut. I was like, what? You know, how of all of the places, they are the most progressive in terms of thinking of alternative ways of thinking about sovereignty and all that. So I'm happy to be able to report that Nunavut, it was a logistical thing. They're going to recognize it from next year. But that wasn't the case with some of the other provinces, particularly the ones that are staunchly right wing. You know, so Alberta. What you got in Alberta, and this was an article from, you know, the summertime still. So Alberta was saying that, well, we don't want to make people think that they should only think about reconciliation on one day. So we will give them no day to think about that, but we encourage them to think about reconciliation every day. Of course, like, that's not taking at all into consideration that one of the 94 recommendations from the Truth and Reconciliation Commission was to establish a day for this. So, you know, you see again the kind of like putting into practice of this kind of right to work, right wing kind of like, we will not shut down the economy even for a day to think about this, that you see in Alberta. And not to bash Alberta only, right? Let's bash New Brunswick for a little bit. So looking at New Brunswick as well, what's fascinating there is that you see, you know, the premier and his office, I guess, took a decision not to recognize it. And now you're seeing lots of municipalities across New Brunswick are kind of throwing up the finger to the premier and saying, well, we as a municipality are going to recognize this day. So I think it's a good thing that we're seeing that even like smaller scale systems of governance are actually ignoring the province at times and saying, no, this is an important day. If you don't get it, that's your business. But, you know, Moncton is going to mark this day, or, you know, like, so is it a mistake? Clearly it's a mistake. They can't even get the buy-in from their own people about this. And it exposes the kind of, you know, we try not to be partisan here, but it's also impossible to talk about these issues without kind of like pointing out how starkly contrasting the right of center and the right is in Canada in terms of being absolutely regressive when it comes to issues of decolonization, indigeneity, anti-Black racism, the whole gambit. So I think it's important for people to know, you know, like, if you or people in your family believe that, you know, you should be just voting for the Conservative Party because you like one thing that they said about, I don't know, fiscal prudence or about your investments or some shit like that, that does make you a bad person. You know what I mean? I'm going to take a moral position there and say, it's not that everybody has their political views and there's no this and that. If you decide that your narrow self-interest is more important than the well-being of like all these other people in your community, like, by definition, in my mind, that makes you a bad person. And I don't mind defending that. You can quote me on that. So anyway, about the second part of the question about, you know, Alex not liking the term sovereignty. So yeah, I think everything that Alex said makes sense. I use the term sovereignty a lot. I have a book coming out on the subject of pluriversal sovereignty, which is a complicated context that I'm not going to get into in any detail here. So I've done a lot of reading in the political theory realm on the subject of sovereignty, but everything Alex said is right. It's a Eurocentric subject. Context. It fails to capture the complexity of autonomous self-rule and even national rule. And it reminds me a lot of what many Indigenous scholars and thinkers and practitioners point to, which is the coloniality of the English language or the French language. I didn't get a chance to look into why Quebec isn't recognizing it, but, you know, I think that probably has a lot to do with Quebec's kind of weird position about themselves as the victims of colonialism, but not Indigenous people. Anyway, I digress. I use the term sovereignty because it is an approximation about autonomy, but it's true that it fails to capture the complexity. And if you look into the history of the term sovereignty, it's actually linked very specifically to the theological kind of Judeo-Christian notion of the body politics and everybody coming together. And in that sense, it actually is linked and connected to the divine right of kings. And, you know, like, for those of you who are really interested in the subject, you can read Stuart Eldon's book on territory. You can read Jacques Maritain's, a kind of French theologian, kind of essay called In Defense of Sovereignty, which actually, like, I don't think actually it explains sovereignty, but it doesn't defend it, at least not from my point of view. He kind of takes this right-wing position describing it, but it's really good scholarship in terms of pointing out just how profoundly, not just Eurocentric, but theological the idea of sovereignty is. And then as a counterpoint to that, I'd encourage people to read Leanne Simpson's essay, I Am Not a Nation State, where she asserts instead what, an Anishinaabe understanding of nationalism looks like. Nationalism, of course, is a little bit different from sovereignty. But yeah, so I use sovereignty in the same way that I use the English language. Problematic, fails to capture the complexity. If it helps you focus on the things that are necessary, and in this case, I think Indigenous sovereignty, even though it's not necessarily the most accurate term to use, what I like about it is that it encourages settlers who have little to no familiarity with thinking about sovereignty outside of the Eurocentric position. It encourages settlers like that to think, okay, if sovereignty means something and we look at the complexity of sovereignty, then Mi'kmaq sovereignty matters when we think about fisheries. Like the fact that one sovereign came from another place and asserted itself over top of another sovereign, that's a problem. I think that should fundamentally be a problem. But I totally concede that in a technical political theory and activist kind of context, sovereignty is not the best word that we could come to. Back to you, Alex.
Yeah, thanks, AJ. I'm just going to pass on a quick note and speak. I'm going to break the fourth wall here and say that you have notes on your lighting. That's apparently you're backlit on the screen, so you might want to fix your lighting. Passing it on from our producer. Okay, on to the next. I think there's so much to say here too. We really could spend longer talking about this. So much of what AJ just said is really stimulating, like including the stuff around the orientation. We've just come through the election, the orientation of people who will vote for political leaders or parties based on narrow self-interest and see that not as ideological or as reproducing a toxic, violent, dehumanizing world, but as narrowly self-interested, right? I mean, it's really worth peeling this all back and thinking about who gets to determine, the status quo, right? When that becomes the yardstick for measuring what's a political or a ethnic or a special interest claim versus what's kind of like broadly acceptable in society, what applies to all of us. These things are already conversations that are so deeply shaped by those pre-existing contexts, right? So we don't need to be mad at each other over that, but we have to acknowledge that. And part of what I think people who are struggling for social justice and to speak about Indigenous people specifically here, I think part of what is so frustrating for groups seeking justice in society is this constant refrain, this constant undermining of them by suggesting that it's just some niche interest, just some special thing that they're asking, some special entitlement, when in fact, colonial reality is a special entitlement that was afforded to this country that became called Canada, that arose out of this particular matrix of violent dispossession and the denial of pre-existing societies, political systems, economic orders, and just hell, like people living here and existing who had the right not to be, trodden upon by newcomers. So, we have more questions about autonomy, which is great. Will I treat these ones the same too? Okay, so somebody just asked, is co-autonomy better? Is co-autonomy better? I guess. I don't know. Like I really, this is going to come down to an editorial choice here, right? I'm going to say I don't like the overcomplication of already existing words. Compound words, co-autonomy, like every form of autonomy, when we divorce it from totally egghead idealized political theory and see how it works in the real world is inherently relational. Because autonomy means, the word actually means to give oneself law, right? To rule over oneself. So, but unlike traditions which celebrate violent and rugged and totally nonsensical individualism, because, hey, you're a human being, actually you're one of the least developed species in terms of solo living. Okay, there's nothing about human beings that like all these right wingers, all this resurgent right politics that want to convince us that we're nothing but like rugged individualists. That's total bullshit nonsense. From an anthropological evolutionary perspective, none of us would even be here, right? We're here because we're deeply social, communicative, problem solving, and relational beings. That's a context we have come out of for millions of years. In fact, certainly for hundreds of thousands when it comes to the most recent iterations of the species we call Homo sapiens. So the basis for our existence is cooperation. And especially before the existence of the state, we're talking about very limited forms of being able to coerce each other into doing shit. You'd have to convince people, cajole them, maybe sometimes shame them, but often kind of like convoke the common spirit of living together in order to get stuff done, right? And autonomy comes from that tradition. The notion of autonomy doesn't mean I get to do whatever I want, because if everybody is autonomous, then the idea is that, well, if we really did exist in that world, it would be the people with the biggest weapons or the most willingness to use violence who would then push the rest of us aside, right? So that de facto isn't autonomy, that's tyranny, right? So when we talk about autonomy, we're already talking about relationality. So I just say, to all the theorists, to the egghead theorists like me who come out of these traditions, I say, drop the co and acknowledge that what we're talking about is a principle that has been practiced by a huge variety of people that's transsocial, right? It crosses boundaries in society, and that's already about figuring out what the reasonable limits to that. So when I say I'm an autonomous individual, or I'm a part of an autonomous collective, or I want to live in an autonomous community, it's not to say that my community has the right to do whatever the hell it wants, because of course our activity has relations or has consequences in the world, right? If I decide I'm going to build like a nuclear munitions factory in my autonomous community, and we're going to we're going to pollute the environment or dam a river or something, it's not to say that our community suddenly has the right to do that because we declare ourselves autonomous, because that activity has incredible detrimental effects, or maybe even positive ones, for other communities, other people, other forms of life. So we're already dealing with a situation where the co is implied, I would say. So don't trouble it even more. Just to remind people that autonomy is all about the principle of giving oneself law in a context where you're living amongst other people and other species too, right? It's the fault of our modern systems of thinking and organizing ourselves that we've lost that. And all we need to do is recover the memory of that. And that exists not simply in Indigenous traditions, but in European ones too. This is what I'd say to all the, red-pilled white nationalists out there, is that the histories you invoke of European peasants, right, before they consider themselves European, of course, is a history of people living autonomously, is a history of people respecting the autonomy of other communities, the right to exist, the right to have one's traditions, the right to have one's territory, and to not be oppressed by the people. And that was denied by the ruling class, right? So it's not a racialized thing necessarily, but of course in our modern world it's become incredibly racialized, incredibly invested with those power dynamics. So again, since that was just kind of a follow-up, if AJ will just bear with me for a sec, I'll go to the next one and he can take them both at the same time again, because it's connected. The next question is, in moving toward collective liberation, should communities / cities start accepting newcomers solely on the basis of their values? For example, a commitment to safeguarding the land. Again, my answer to this is pretty straightforward, I think. And so I'm going to keep it brief and then pass it over to AJ. I would say values tests inherently make me nervous. And I don't think this is a good principle. I think in idealized terms, this is what most of us want. And on my dark days, when I'm feeling really fed up with the world, I absolutely feel this way. I'm like, oh, why can't I just live in a community like, dealing with COVID deniers and anti-vaxxers and anti-maskers right now? I really feel like some days I want to run for the hills and just be amongst my people and be like, I just want to live with people who think what I think and agree with, and we can broadly agree and move forward and not have to endlessly have these ridiculous fights. Like, I'm tired of fighting with racists about, their nonsense, bullshit, totally disproven ideas about the biologically essentialist racism, right? That has been so thoroughly debunked by decades of science that it is the equivalent to arguing that the earth is flat. In all honesty today, you will not find a reputable geneticist who's willing to support you on this. No body of evidence that actually supports this kind of stuff. So why do we have to keep fighting about it, right? I just wish that would be it. On the other hand, I would say that as soon as we get into this idea that we're going to vet people for specific sets of values that make them amenable, worthy of living in our society, there are already people planning on doing that, and that is a tactic that really belongs to the far right, to fascists, to racists, to reactionaries everywhere. I mean, look at, Bernier's PPC again. One of the things that they were floating is this idea of a values test. The regime in Quebec, values test, cultural literacy tests, these kinds of things across Europe. We're seeing a wave of right-wing reactionaryism that really revolves around this idea of testing for values. And what that's code for, of course, is how close to European are you? Can you assimilate to what we regard as Western civilization? Are you worthy of being included? Or will you be one of those unwashed masses, the dark, unwashed tide that will be kept at our shores and kept outside? So I'm as uncomfortable with the idea of people who are avowedly committed to social justice doing that as I am opposed to the idea of, our enemies doing that. I don't think you can't do an end run around it. It would be nice if it were that simple, right? But I think as long as if this is what human society looks like, these big societies where lots of people come together, then you're going to have to deal with people who you don't agree with, and sometimes who you wouldn't want to necessarily spend a lot of time with. But it's part of the work of living together that we engage with one another. Sometimes we fight, sometimes we discuss, sometimes we don't convince each other, and that needs to be okay at a certain level. At a certain level, it kind of has to be, right? We will always deal with authoritarianism, with coercion, with violence, with hatefulness, no matter how far past this rotten iteration of social organization we get. We will always have that among us, and we can't just purge it by value tests. And the idea that we would in the same way, what would you have? Would you have how would you practice that practically? Would you have borders? Would you have guards? Who gets to make the test? What kinds of principles are upheld in there? So many issues with that. So no, I don't feel we can do that. And I feel, in fact, in some ways that makes us a lot less safe. It's what the white nationalists want, right? This is when white nationalists speak in their most scrubbed language to reporters, they're like, no, we don't want to kill anybody. We just want our own state to live in, and everybody else can just go off and be diverse somewhere else, right? But of course, the devil is in the details. Well, how are you going to purge that area of that territory of the people you don't want? You could turn that around and ask that same question of the left, right? If we were to go that route, how would we purge the territory of the people we don't want? How would we assess them? What would we do with them? How would we compensate them for their lost livelihoods, houses, all kinds of stuff, right? It just gets super gross and complicated right away, and I don't think we make ourselves safer by purging people. I guess that's what I'd say. I'm going to leave it at that and pass it back to AJ.
Right on. Thanks for that, Ali. I don't really have anything to add to the co-autonomy piece, so I'm going to leave the co-autonomy question and just focus on the second question, which I just want to get the wording right. in moving towards collective liberation, should community cities start accepting newcomers solely on the basis of their values? So again, I applaud the sentiment, but it reminds me of a couple of different pieces of literature that I'll name here so that people will add them to the reading list. The first is Audre Lorde's short essay, what's it called, about the master's tools. I have it up here. The master's tools will never dismantle the master's house. And in addition to that piece, the other two are both books by Harsha Walia. One is called Undoing Border Imperialism, and the other is called Borders and Rule, which is a new book out just this year, which I haven't read yet, but I'm sure, knowing Harsha's work, I'm sure it's going to be excellent. And I guess this is what to say, if the problem is state power, and this has kind of emerged as a theme for today's conversation, which is pretty cool. But if the problem is the way that the state borders places, and creates these artificial borders and criminalizes the existence of people, I guess my concern, and this is related, I think, to, generally speaking, to anarchist concerns about this level of concentration of power, is that if it is the state that is the corrupting influence, the values are going to be corrupted, co-opted, and subverted as well. We can't use exclusionary weapons like that as a way of ensuring the safety of the land. What we need to do instead is build protecting land, respecting treaty obligations, and working alongside and with Indigenous people towards decolonization and reclaiming and reinserting Indigenous principles onto the land where they were kind of taken from. That needs to be a daily practice. So there's no safe spot where we can kind of put a border around ourselves and hope that we can keep the bad people out, which then kind of makes me thoughtful about another book, which I haven't had a chance to read in its entirety, but I think even the pieces that I'm familiar with, it's called Insurgent Love by our friend Ardith Wynot, that talks a lot about kind of what Alex was saying about the need to think differently about, the carceral system, and to think differently about what we do with the bad people, what we do with the people whose values we don't agree with. Because remember, like, progressive movements, I think fundamentally what differentiates us from the more fearful right-wing movements is that we're interested in love and collective liberation. This question is motivated by an interest in collective liberation. And we can't wield that through a weapon of fear, which is what I understand borders in general to be. If you look at the history of immigration law and policy in Canada, which I've spent an inordinate amount of time doing over the course of the last several years, the morality laws have been extreme. Like until 1947, if you were a woman and the man who controls your life committed an quote unquote immoral act, they didn't need to get more specific, you and your children could be deported from Canada. If you had a mental illness, or if you were deemed to be, a pauper, so if you had no money, you could be deported from Canada, because this wasn't the kind of person that meshed with the industrious, Protestant work ethic of the developing Canadian state. So I think the history makes it impossible for us to ignore that we, as progressive, well-intentioned people, are not able to wield state power in that way. So I think I agree with Alex that we need to reject the idea of like a values test in terms of determining who comes in, and commit our efforts instead to working with people who are here and who arrive here to educate them about, what a good way of living needs to look like. Back to you, Alex.
Yeah, thanks, AJ. Thanks for that. Yeah, and I guess I would throw out another book there too, just as an addition, one that we've already mentioned in previous installments, but I'd say Gavin Titley's Is Free Speech Racist, which is a nice tight little book, 100 odd pages long, that was released just last year. Talks about this, this sort of values test rhetoric that underwrites so much of the modern far right discourse in relation to who belongs and who doesn't. And I just really recommend that book. It's a great book. It is a little bit more academic in its tone and vocabulary, but a great and important critical read that really like centers some of this stuff. And I think the upshot from that book and from so many people working in these areas, like AJ is just talking about, is that there's just a really long road to walk to live in a decent, dignified, democratic, peaceful society. Like there are no shortcuts, and it would be nice if there were. It'd be nice if we could just say all the bad people get out. Those of us who are decent people get to live here. But you just also make those other people who you don't want other people's problems then, right? Like if all we do is exile people, they're going to go somewhere, they're just going to go to a different community, right? How is that solving that? You get it out of your own backyard and into somebody else's. Anyway, great questions, though. Very, very good, thoughtful questions. Moving along, we have a few minutes left, so maybe we can get through two more. If violence and heteropatriarchy characterized elements of some pre-colonial Indigenous societies, are non-Indigenous Canadians biased in their worldview to fundamentally challenge those practices? So this is a good and complicated question. First of all, I think that, at the root of this question, I guess I would mine out the challenge to, overly romantic ideas about any human society, right? And I think it's absolutely fair and fine to acknowledge that there are, humans are not only social, creative, problem-solving, communicative, all this kind of stuff, but also are terribly good at finding bad things to do to each other. And every human society has some of this, obviously, and Indigenous societies are no exception. I mean, both the Aztec and the Inca as examples in Mesoamerica were empires, and in part the reason they fell to the conquistadors in both cases, especially in the Aztecs case, was because the Aztecs had made a lot of enemies among other local nations, right, who were happy to align themselves with the Spanish when they arrived, and to get rid of the Aztecs, because the Aztecs were seen as oppressors. And now that doesn't mean that the Aztecs deserve to be destroyed or that colonialism is a good thing, right? So, like, this is just like contemporary arguments, I would say, around imperialism. So, we have the imperialism of fools, or the anti-imperialism of fools. Historically, was used to refer to this, the turn towards anti-Semitism on parts of the left, to blame like a world Jewish conspiracy, for example, for all the problems. Today, the anti-imperialism of fools tends to refer to people who basically fall into the camp of believing anyone who is opposed to U.S. or Western imperialism broadly is a good guy. So we had these arguments a few years back around Syria, right, where you had especially tankies, unapologetic supporters of the Soviet Union, the legacy of the Russian Revolution, but not only. We're saying things like, well, Bashar al-Assad is a good guy because he's opposing Western imperialism, and many of the stories being told about him are lies, and the white helmets are imperial pawns and all this kind of stuff. And it basically resulted in a totally ridiculous black and white version of what was happening on the ground in Syria, which resulted in many leftists, Western leftists, giving a pass to a person who is committing war crimes against his own people and his own territory that many different institutions and organizations, not only the United States, agreed he was doing, and actually magnifying that suffering greatly because of the brake it put on any kind of willingness to put a stop to it. And I'm not saying, U.S. imperialism was the solution to al-Assad's regime, right? But certainly kind of endlessly apologizing for it and saying that never happened doesn't get us anywhere either. So too with these complex accounts of societies. Yeah, like there's lots of good evidence, like people of all stripes have engaged in slavery, awful acts of violence, interpersonally, exploitation and oppression, all these kinds of things. So there's no need to suggest anything else about that historically. Now, was that worse here than it was elsewhere? No, there's no evidence for that either. I think what we're doing in terms of the work we're doing right now is not so much trying to change any of that went before, but certainly crafting a new path forward for all of us, right? And this is what I mean when I talk about collective liberation. So Taiyaki Alfred, who's a Mohawk scholar, talks about this in terms of a self-conscious traditionalism, right? So what Alfred says in his work is that he's not interested in a politics of Indigenous resurgence that's simply predicated on returning to some imagined past, as if that's even possible, right? How would you do that? Practically speaking, like, you don't have a time machine, you can't just turn back the clock. And anyway, most people aren't interested in that, right? What they're interested in is recovering those elements of tradition, of nationhood, of their people's identity that they can preserve and continue to celebrate and honor and live with, and then develop in the world. So too with non-Indigenous settler Canadians, right? I think we don't need to either engage in this kind of spurious politics of either lampooning or celebrating history. We can much more productively say, okay, what's the society we want to live in together, right? Like, how does that look? How does that work? How can we be decent and dignified in our relations to one another, and give each other space and security and the ability to thrive, right? And so I don't think it means, like, if you're looking at history, the histories as we understand them, and remember, history is always a living work in progress, right? Like, part of what we know is shaped by, the genocide that went before in this case too, right? How accurate are our histories of societies that no longer exist as they once did because they were subject to incredible colonial genocidal violence, right? Just like our histories of, like, European peasant life are hopelessly lost in time in some ways, because the only accounts we have of them are the accounts written by, priests or other religious officials or the ruling class. Like, that's all you have, right? Because peasants couldn't read or write. So we have none of their own histories handed down. So our understanding of what that life was like is necessarily constrained. It doesn't mean, we have to imagine them either as utopias or as nightmares. We can simply honor them as once actually existing experiments in human social possibility. And in terms of moving forward, we can simply say it's enough that there are people who want to defend and recover what that means, and who have the right, and the treaty rights in this case, to do so alongside of the newcomers who came here, and who also have a right to, like the Two-Row Wampum suggests, to steer our own crafts along the same river without interfering with each other. Over to you, AJ.
Yeah, thanks, Alex, for that really robust answer. I'll just add a few things to it, because I think we're generally in agreement here. The kind of overarching context that I would start my answer here with actually goes back to why I like the term sovereignty and why I use the term sovereignty. Because part of sovereignty means, whatever the people inside of a community are, like, whatever their problems are, whatever their benefits are their problems and their benefits to sort out. And in a way, there's a kind of collective autonomy rather than an individual autonomy associated with that. I'm reminded of a quote, which, I mean, maybe this is a paraphrase of a quote that Edward Said made on the subject when asked about Palestinian statehood, one of the 800,000 times he was asked about Palestinian statehood. And he said, "Form a Palestinian state and I will be the first to criticize it." And I think what Said was getting at there is the fact that, it's easy to want to create a moral standard that is not achievable, to be a kind of bar that oppressed people need to demonstrate in order to justify a change to the status quo. And I'm not suggesting that's where this question is coming from, but I'm thinking, like, in terms of when we kind of create this. So there's two pieces here. One piece is that we can't create a moral criteria that is so kind of abstractly unachievable, create a society free from heteropatriarchy, and then and only then we can go down this road. Well, I mean, that we haven't seen what that looks like yet. Nobody, to the best of my knowledge, has achieved a society free from structural forms of violence, heteropatriarchy chiefly among them. But then the second part of it too is the second part of it is the kind of moral expectation that we kind of put on oppressed peoples, broadly conceived, to come up individually with the answers to these big problems. And Alex mentioned Tayage Alfred, so I'll just share a quick story about one time I was fortunate to see, Professor Alfred speak at a conference in Victoria. And interestingly, he was talking about his relationship with Harsha Walia, his intellectual and professional relationship with Harsha Walia. And he was telling a story, and he said, he told us, so I'm paraphrasing Tayage Alfred here, he said that when he was young and just getting started, the only thing he wanted from settlers was their allegiance and their obedience. Just do what I tell you and get out of the way. And then he said, as I became more mature and I met people like Harsha Walia, who's a brown woman migrant to Canada, and Harsha had the courage and the respect to disagree with him and to fight him on certain issues and to push back on the points where she disagreed on. He said, I realized very quickly that that's actually what real respect looks like, is when you respect somebody's ideas enough to disagree with them and to help them to make them better. So, it's a fine line between the way that we want to defer to whether it's Indigenous or Black or whatever kind of part of the margin that you might come from. We do need to defer to expertise, but if you really want to respect people's ideas, you have to be willing to give your all in terms of helping to build that project. And that's why many of you have heard people talk about the need for co-conspirators rather than an ally. A co-conspirator is somebody involved in the conspiracy, somebody who's an active agent. And I think especially when we think about the rhythms of what Indigenous scholars have called resurgence approaches to understanding indigeneity and settler colonialism, resurgence is forward thinking, even while embracing aspects of pre-colonial knowledge. It's also very much about dealing with the here and now. So I don't think that we should be expecting Indigenous, we shouldn't. Let me get the exact wording of the question again. I don't have it in front of me. So the question was, with violence and heteropatriarchy characterized elements of some pre-colonial Indigenous societies, are non-Indigenous Canadians biased in their worldview to fundamentally challenge the practices? No, you're not. You're not biased, and heteropatriarchy is something that should be opposed in all society all the time because it's wrong. And having the courage to argue against something that's wrong, regardless of the cultural context. A lot of people might make all kinds of arguments on the basis of culture. We can't be culturally relative. Cultural relativism. I don't like the way people use the term cultural relativism because I think universalists like to use that term in a dismissive way. I think you need to respect people's culture enough to disagree with the aspects of culture that need augmentation, because culture, like Alex was saying, is a constantly developing process. So yeah, that's my answer. And I think we're probably coming up on time here, Alex. So
I think that's true. I was as usual, my time management is one of my least developed skills. And I thought we might make the last one. We had a great last question. We're just going to have to save it for next month. Promise we'll get to it. But I'm just going to say very quickly, thanks for showing up, folks. Thanks for your questions. Great ones as always, really rich material for discussion. I'm going to let AJ have the last word on this, as we usually do. I open, he's going to close. I'm just going to say, for those of you living in the settler colonial state known as Canada right now, I hope you do have a chance to take some time tomorrow to engage in good conversation with friends, family, folks around you, people who will put up with you, thinking and talking about what decolonization, reconciliation, and an honest accounting of what it cost to build this settler colonial society known as Canada, and who paid that cost, and who deserves to have the chance to chart their own course right now. And that includes settler Canadians, of course, but it most prominently includes I think, the victims of that process first, and those victims were Indigenous people, the survivors of that process as well. So I hope you have the time to do that. Take some time, think, talk, be with each other. Go to an event if you can too, or if you haven't done it yet, read the recommendations of the commission. Anyway, see you next month. Thanks for being here. Over to you, AJ.
Thanks, Alex. Yeah, the only thing I would add to that, I agree with everything Alex just said. One kind of logistical point that I would like to leave everyone with is that now that we have this new time period of 2 to 3 o'clock, we've now also, our pals at Fernwood have set up a standing Facebook invitation or whatever, that event page. It's a term I'm looking for. So I'd encourage you to just connect to that. It has all of our upcoming events all the way until July. So we're committed to this for the long haul too. And if you like what you see, or if you don't like what you see, but you still think it might be useful, try and invite like 5-6 people, let them know about that we're doing this project, and hopefully we can have even more people taking advantage of the opportunity to pose questions as well as to view them after the fact. So many thanks to our pals at Fernwood for setting this up so that we can do some forward planning. And yeah, very much looking forward to talking to you next month. All the best.